The blinking cursor on the screen was a tiny, pulsing monument to my failure. It mocked me from the wasteland of page 17, a page that had looked exactly the same for the past 6 hours. My thesis, a sprawling, ambitious disaster about post-structuralism in contemporary queer cinema, was due in 3 days. And I was completely, utterly stuck. The words had dried up, leaving behind a gritty residue of panic in my throat. My apartment, usually a sanctuary of quiet focus, felt like a cage. The stacks of books on the floor were no longer pillars of knowledge. They were leaning towers of accusation. Each spine seemed to whisper my name in disappointment. Leo, you're not good enough. My world had shrunk to this single room, this single document, this single, blinking cursor. Outside, the city was alive, a distant hum of traffic and sirens, but in here, time had congealed. The only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart and the low growl of the empty coffee pot. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the greasy strands, and glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Too late to be productive, too early to give up. It was in this state of quiet desperation that I did something I had sworn I would never do. I opened my email and composed a message to Dr. Alistair Finch. Dr. Finch. Even thinking his name felt like an overstep. He was my thesis advisor, a man whose intellect was so sharp it felt like a physical presence in a room. He taught courses that students fought to get into, not because they were easy, but because they were transformative. He spoke about Foucault and Butler with a casual intimacy, as if they were old friends he'd just had coffee with. In his lectures, he had this habit of pushing his glasses up his nose with one finger, his eyes, a startlingly clear shade of gray, scanning the lecture hall as if he were taking the measure of every single mind in the room. I had spent the better part of 2 years utterly captivated by him. It was a pathetic, academic crush, the kind you read about. I was drawn to the mind first, the way he dismantled complex theories and reassembled them into something beautiful and clear. But then the rest of it followed. The low, calm timbre of his voice. The way his tweed jackets, which should have looked stuffy, instead seemed to suggest a quiet, unshakable confidence. The rare, small smile that would touch his lips when a student made a particularly insightful point. My crush was my own closely guarded secret, a low-grade fever that I managed with professional distance and a lot of internal screaming. To him, I was just Leo Thorne, a promising but perhaps overly anxious graduate student. Another name on a long list of academic responsibilities. He was always professional, always helpful, but there was an inherent distance to him, an intellectual boundary that I never dreamed of crossing. Which was why sending this email felt like waving a giant white flag of incompetence. Dr. Finch, I typed, my fingers trembling slightly. I know it's terribly late, but I've hit a significant wall with my chapter on cinematic gaze. I feel I'm arguing in circles. I wouldn't bother you if it weren't so close to the deadline. Any brief guidance would be immensely appreciated. It was pathetic. Needy. I hit send before I could lose my nerve. I expected nothing. Maybe a terse reply in the morning, pointing me to a reading I'd already dissected a dozen times. I pushed back from my desk, the chair groaning in protest, and decided to surrender to the coffee pot. As I was measuring out the grounds, my phone buzzed on the counter. An email notification. My heart gave a painful lurch. It was from him. The timestamp was 11:51 p.m. For minutes. Leo, it read. These things happen. Don't spiral. I have some old research notes that might offer a fresh perspective. They're not digitized. I'm just finishing up at the office now. I could drop them by on my way home, if you're not opposed to a late visitor. I live just a few blocks from you. Alistair. I read the email 3 times. My brain couldn't process it. I could drop them by. Alistair. He had never signed an email with his first name before. It was always a Finch or Dr. Finch. The cursor in my brain was blinking now, just as uselessly as the one on my screen. This was beyond generosity. This was unheard of. Professors didn't make house calls at midnight. A wave of panic washed over me, followed by a jolt of something else, something warm and terrifyingly hopeful. I thought about the state of my apartment. The dirty coffee mugs, the pile of laundry I'd been ignoring in the corner, the general air of scholarly decay. That would be incredible, I typed back, my thumbs fumbling on the small screen. Please don't feel obligated, but I would be very grateful. My address is 14B, Archer Street. I hit send and was immediately consumed by a frantic, nervous energy. I flew around the tiny apartment, shoving loose papers into folders, hiding the laundry pile in the closet, and wiping down the coffee table. I was rinsing out a mug when I heard the heavy buzz of the intercom. My stomach twisted itself into a knot. I pressed the button. It's Alistair Finch. His voice, slightly distorted by the cheap speaker, still sent a shiver through me. It was that same calm, measured tone from his lectures, but hearing it in this context, directed at me, felt impossibly intimate. Coming, I managed to say, my own voice a reedy whisper. I buzzed him in and then stood frozen, my hand on my doorknob, listening to the slow, steady footsteps ascending the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment. Each step seemed to land directly on my ribcage. This is happening. He is coming here. I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to compose myself. I was a graduate student. He was my professor. This was a professional courtesy, nothing more. But my heart wasn't listening to reason. It was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The knock on the door was soft, just 2 quick raps. I pulled it open, and there he was. He looked different out of the lecture hall. Taller, somehow. More real. The harsh fluorescent lights of my hallway were less forgiving than the soft lighting of the university, but they did nothing to diminish him. He had taken off his tweed jacket and was just in a dark gray button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong, capable forearms dusted with fine, dark hair. His glasses were perched on his nose, and his hair, a mix of dark brown and distinguished silver at the temples, was slightly damp from the misty night air. He was holding a worn leather satchel in one hand and a thick, beige folder in the other. "Leo," he said, and his voice was even lower, even richer in person. It resonated in the small space of my doorway. "Dr. Finch." "Alistair." I corrected myself, stumbling over the name. "Please, come in. Thank you so much for this. You really didn't have to." "It was no trouble," he said, stepping over the threshold. The moment he entered, my small apartment seemed to shrink, reorienting itself around him. He brought the scent of the night with him, damp earth, cold air, and something else, something subtle and clean, like expensive soap and old paper. It was a scent I would forever associate with him. "You have a lot of books," he observed, his gray eyes scanning my overstuffed shelves with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't judgment, more like recognition. "It's a hazard of the trade, I suppose," I said, my attempt at a joke falling flat in the tense air. I gestured vaguely towards my small, cluttered living area. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Tea? Water?" I was babbling. "Tea would be nice, if you have it," he said, his gaze settling on me. It was an unnervingly direct look. In the lecture hall, his gaze was diffuse, spread across 100 students. Here, it was focused solely on me, and I felt pinned by it, exposed. I felt the sudden, desperate urge to smooth down my shirt, to comb my hair, to somehow make myself appear less like a man slowly unraveling. Of course, I escaped to the kitchenette, my back to him, grateful for a moment to breathe. I fumbled with the kettle, my hands shaking as I filled it with water. I could feel him behind me, not moving, just standing there. The silence was deafening. I risked a glance over my shoulder. He hadn't moved. He was just watching me, his expression thoughtful. He had placed the folder of notes on my coffee table, but he was still holding his satchel. It was as if he was deciding whether or not to stay. "So, the cinematic gaze," he said, his voice startling me. He had moved and was now standing by my desk, looking at the screen where my failed thesis chapter was still displayed. "You're getting bogged down in the theory, trying to make the films fit Mulvey's framework, instead of letting the films challenge it." He spoke with such effortless authority. He saw the problem in an instant, a problem I had been wrestling with for days. I brought over 2 mugs of tea, placing one on a coaster near him. Our fingers brushed as he took it. A tiny, insignificant contact that felt like a jolt of static electricity. My breath hitched. "I'm losing my mind. This is purely professional." "I think you're right," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've been so focused on proving the thesis that I've stopped actually watching the films." "Exactly," he said, taking a sip of his tea. He looked at me over the rim of the mug, and his eyes were kind. It was a look I'd never seen before. In class, he was challenging, probing, pushing us to be better. But this was different. This was gentle, "The notes might help," he said, nodding toward the folder. "They're from my own doctoral work. A bit dated, but the core ideas are there." I was wrestling with similar problems. He was sharing a piece of his own academic struggle with me. It was a small act of vulnerability, a deliberate closing of the gap between us. We stood there for a moment, sipping our tea in a silence that was no longer deafening but companionable. The initial awkwardness began to melt away, replaced by a quiet hum of awareness. I was acutely conscious of his presence, of the way his shoulders filled out his shirt, of the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, of the steady, even rhythm of his breathing. He didn't seem to be in any hurry to leave. He finished his tea and set the mug down, then wandered over to my bookshelf, his long fingers trailing along the spines of my books. He was a physical person, I realized. He interacted with the world through touch. He'd touched the mug, the desk, the books. My mind replayed the brief, accidental brush of our fingers, and a foolish warmth spread through my chest. "You have a good collection," he murmured, pulling out a slim volume of poetry. "Cabify. An interesting choice for a film theorist." He understood yearning, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. It was too honest, too revealing. Alistair turned his head, his gray eyes fixing on me again. He held my gaze for a long moment, and the air in the room grew thick and heavy. I felt like he could see right through me, past the anxious student and into the lonely, wanting core of me. He didn't say anything. He just slid the book back into its place, his movements slow and deliberate. He stayed for another hour. We talked, not just about my thesis, but about everything. About the films we loved, the books that had changed us, the stifling nature of academia, the quiet joys of living in the city. The dynamic between us shifted. The strict roles of professor and student began to dissolve, leaving two men talking in a small, book-filled room late at night. He was witty and unexpectedly funny, with a dry, self-deprecating sense of humor. He told a story about a disastrous academic conference in Berlin that made me laugh, a real, genuine laugh that felt rusty from disuse. And I watched him. I watched the way his lips curved when he smiled. I watched the way he gestured with his hands when he was making a point, his fingers long and elegant. I watched the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners. Every small detail felt significant, a clue to the man behind the formidable intellect. I was gathering these details like treasures, storing them away. The internal analysis was a constant, frantic hum beneath the surface of our conversation. When his knee brushed against mine as he shifted on the uncomfortable armchair, my entire nervous system lit up. Was that an accident? Of course it was an accident. This chair is tiny. But he didn't move it away. He's letting it rest there. "Stop it, Leo. You're projecting." When he leaned in closer to hear something I said, his cologne washing over me, a warm, spicy scent of sandalwood and bergamot, my thoughts scattered. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I could see the individual silver strands at his temple. My mind went completely blank. I forgot what I was saying, forgot how to form words. He just waited, patient, his gaze soft, until I found my voice again. He didn't call attention to my lapse. He simply gave me the space to recover. This quiet consideration was more intimate than any touch. It was an act of seeing me, of recognizing my anxiety and choosing to be gentle with it. As the conversation deepened, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The panic about my thesis had receded, replaced by this profound, all-encompassing awareness of him. The world outside my apartment had ceased to exist. There was only this room, the low light from my desk lamp, and the sound of his voice. He asked me a question that caught me off guard. "What do you want to do, Leo? After all this is over?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the books and papers, at the whole apparatus of academic life. No one had asked me that. The assumption was that I would follow the prescribed path, finish the PhD, publish, find a tenure-track position, and repeat the cycle. "I don't know," I admitted, the honesty of it surprising me. I just want to be quiet for a while. Maybe find a small cinema, one of those old single-screen places, and just watch movies. Not for analysis, just for the love of it." He nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. "The love of it," he repeated softly, as if tasting the words. "It's easy to lose that in here." He looked around the room again. "This life, it can be isolating." It was a statement, not a question, but it felt like he was extending a hand to me in the dark. He was admitting to a shared experience, a shared loneliness. This was his moment of softness, his own admission of vulnerability. The great Dr. Finch, the intellectual titan, was admitting that he, too, felt the isolation of this life. It shattered the last of my illusions about him. He wasn't an idol to be worshipped from afar. He was a man who felt lonely, a man who was sitting in my apartment at 2 in the morning, his knee still resting gently against mine. The clock on my laptop ticked over to 2:15 a.m. The spell was breaking. The real world was beginning to intrude. "I should let you go," I said, the words feeling like a betrayal. I didn't want him to go. I wanted him to stay here forever, in this bubble of quiet understanding we had created. "Yes," he said, but he made no move to stand up. He just kept looking at me, his gray eyes searching my face. The silence stretched, filled with everything we weren't saying. The air was so thick with tension I could barely breathe. This was it, the loaded interaction, the moment where the subtext was screaming. "Do you feel this too?" I wanted to ask. Is this just in my head? But I said nothing. I was a coward. I had spent my whole life observing, analyzing, living inside my own head. I didn't know how to act. I didn't know how to reach out and take what I wanted. Finally, with a soft sigh that seemed to carry an immense weight, he pushed himself to his feet. "The notes should help," he said, his voice back to its more formal, professional tone. The shift was jarring. It was over. I had imagined it all. "Thank you," I said, my voice hollow. I walked him to the door, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. This was the price of my cowardice. A few hours of warmth followed by an eternity of replaying this night in my head, wondering what I should have done differently. He stood in the doorway, his hand on the knob. He paused, his back to me. I could see the tension in his shoulders. He was going to leave. The moment was slipping away, turning into just another memory, another thing for me to overthink. A wave of desperate, reckless bravery washed over me. I had to say something. Anything. "Alistair," I said. Just his name. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a knife. He stopped. He didn't turn around, not at first. He just stood there, perfectly still. Then, slowly, he turned his head, looking at me over his shoulder. His expression was unreadable, his face cast in the dim light of the hallway. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. He let go of the doorknob. He turned around fully to face me. The space between us was only a few feet, but it felt like a canyon. He took one step, then another, closing the distance until he was standing directly in front of me. He was so close I could see the faint lines around his eyes, the subtle shift of his expression as he looked down at me. He was searching for something in my face, and I didn't know if he found it. He lifted a hand, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to pat me on the shoulder, a final, patronizing gesture to put me back in my place as his student. But he didn't. His hand hovered in the air between us for a heartbeat, and then he reached out, his fingers gently brushing against my cheek. His touch was feather-light, hesitant, as if he were touching something impossibly fragile. My eyes fluttered shut. I couldn't breathe. This was real. This was happening. And then he dropped his hand. My eyes flew open, a fresh wave of disappointment crashing over me. But he hadn't stepped back. He was still there, his gaze intense, burning with an emotion I couldn't name. He looked from my eyes to my mouth and back again. He reached for the small table next to the door, where his satchel and the folder of notes he'd brought for me were sitting. I thought he was gathering his things to finally leave. But he only picked up the folder. He held it for a moment, this flimsy excuse for his visit, this symbol of the professional boundary between us. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he placed the folder back down on the table. It was a declaration, a choice. He was setting aside the reason he was here, the thing that kept us apart. My heart stops. It just stops. I am suspended in this moment, a single frame in a film, held in the breathless quiet between one action and the next. The world narrows to the space between us. I can feel the warmth of his body, smell the scent of his skin, the faint, lingering aroma of tea and old books. His eyes, those incredible gray eyes, are locked on mine, and for the first time, they are not unreadable. They are filled with a raw, undisguised vulnerability that mirrors my own. It's a look of profound, aching want. He takes a breath, a small, sharp intake of air, and then he moves. It's not fast, not rushed. Every motion is intentional, measured. He lifts both of his hands, and I watch them, mesmerized. They are capable hands, the hands of a writer, a thinker, but there is a strength in them, in the defined knuckles and the clean, short nails. He brings them to my waist, his thumbs resting just above my hip bones. I flinch, not out of fear, but out of the sheer, overwhelming shock of the contact. He pauses, his hands still, giving me a chance to pull away. It is a silent question. Is this okay? I can only manage a small, almost imperceptible nod. My entire body is trembling. Seeing my assent, he continues. His hands slide upward, slowly, over the thin cotton of my t-shirt. I feel the heat of his palms through the fabric, a spreading warmth that chases away the chill of my anxiety. He moves with an agonizing slowness, mapping the terrain of my ribs, my chest. And then, his fingers reach the hem of my shirt. They hesitate there for a single, charged second before they dip underneath. The touch of his skin against mine is electric. His palms are warm and slightly rough, and they flatten against my stomach, a firm, grounding pressure. My breath catches in my throat. I feel dizzy, lightheaded. He slides his hands further up, under my shirt, his fingers spreading wide over my ribs. He is holding me, really holding me. His thumbs draw slow, deliberate circles on my skin, and the simple, repetitive motion is both calming and excruciatingly arousing. I close my eyes, overwhelmed by the sensation. It is the most profoundly intimate thing I have ever felt. More intimate than any kiss, any fumbled encounter from my past. It is a touch of pure intention, of claiming. I place my own trembling hands on his arms, gripping his sleeves. I need to hold on to something. I need to anchor myself before I dissolve completely. I can feel the hard muscle beneath the soft fabric of his shirt. He is so solid, so real. He leans in, and I brace myself for a kiss, but he doesn't kiss me. Not yet. He rests his forehead against mine. Our glasses clink together softly. His eyes are closed now, too. I can feel his breath on my lips, warm and smelling faintly of tea. We just stand there, in the doorway of my messy apartment, breathing each other in. Leo, he whispers, my name a prayer against my mouth. His voice is rough with an emotion he can no longer hide. Alistair, I breathe back. And then he kisses me. It is not a kiss of frantic, pin-up passion. It is slow and deep and breathtakingly gentle. It is a kiss of discovery, of confirmation. His lips are soft, hesitant at first, asking another question. I answer by leaning into him, by parting my lips slightly. He groans, a low, guttural sound in the back of his throat, and deepens the kiss. One of his hands slides from my ribs up my back, pulling me flush against him. I can feel the solid wall of his chest, the frantic beating of his heart mirroring my own. The other hand comes up to cradle the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me steady. This kiss is honest. It feels like coming home to a place I've never been before. All the years of silent yearning, of watching him from afar, of analyzing every glance and every word. It all coalesces into this single, perfect moment. There are no more roles, no more boundaries. There is no professor, no student. There is only Alistair. And Leo. There is only us. The kiss ends as slowly as it began. He pulls back just enough to look at me, his forehead still resting against mine. His eyes are dark, his pupils blown wide. His lips are slightly swollen, and he looks wrecked, undone, in a way that makes my heart ache with a fierce, protective tenderness. I've wanted to do that, he says, his voice a low rasp, for a very long time. The confession hangs in the air between us, shimmering and beautiful. Me too. I whisper, the words feeling inadequate to capture the sheer depth of my longing. He smiles, a real, unguarded smile that transforms his entire face. It makes him look younger, less burdened. He leans in and gives me another kiss, this one short and soft, a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I had been waiting my entire life to hear. He doesn't leave. He closes the door behind him, the soft click of the latch sealing us inside, together, in the quiet solitude of the night. I woke to the unfamiliar sensation of sunlight on my face. For a moment, I was disoriented, my mind thick with sleep. My apartment was never this bright in the morning. Then it all came rushing back in a dizzying, heart-stopping flood. Alistair, his hands under my shirt, his mouth on mine. The quiet hours that followed, filled with more soft kisses and whispered confessions on my lumpy sofa, until we had both drifted off, fully clothed, tangled together like vines. My eyes flew open. I was alone. I was on the sofa, a thick woolen blanket I didn't recognize draped over me. The apartment was silent. A cold, sharp panic seized me, squeezing the air from my lungs. He was gone. He'd left. He regretted it. It was a mistake, a moment of late-night madness, and he had woken up in the cold light of day and fled, horrified by his lapse in professional judgment. I sat up, the blanket pooling around my waist. The room was tidy. My teacup from the night before was gone. His was gone, too. The folder of notes was still on the coffee table, a stark reminder of the pretense that had brought him here. It felt like an accusation. My heart hammered against my ribs. I felt sick. How could I have been so stupid, so naive? To believe that he could actually want me, Leo Thorne, the anxious, unremarkable graduate student. I swung my legs off the sofa and stood up, my body stiff and sore. I had to know. I walked on unsteady feet to the front door. His satchel, which had been on the small table, was gone. His coat was gone. A wave of desolation washed over me, so powerful it made me sway. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door, closing my eyes against the sting of tears. And then I smelled it. Coffee, rich and dark. The scent was coming from my tiny kitchenette. My head snapped up. I turned, my heart doing a slow, painful flip in my chest. And there he was. Alistair was standing by my counter, his back to me. He was still wearing the same gray shirt and dark trousers from last night, though they were now rumpled from sleep. His sleeves were still rolled up his forearms. He was holding my favorite mug, the chipped blue one, and was pouring coffee from my battered French press into it. He looked domestic. He looked like he belonged here. The relief was so intense, so absolute, that my knees felt weak. He hadn't left. He was here. He was making coffee in my kitchen. He must have heard me move, because he turned his head. His hair was messy, sticking up in the back, and there were faint sleep lines on his cheek. He looked at me, and a slow, soft smile spread across his face. It was the same unguarded smile from the night before, and it made my breath catch. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "Morning," I managed to croak out, my voice thick with sleep and residual panic. He turned back to the counter and poured a second mug of coffee. My mug. He picked them both up and walked over to me. He moved with a quiet confidence, as if making coffee for me in my apartment was the most natural thing in the world. He handed me my mug, his fingers brushing against mine. This time, the touch wasn't a shocking jolt. It was a quiet reassurance. A promise. "I didn't want to leave without saying goodbye," he said, his eyes searching my face. He must have seen the fear and uncertainty there, the remnants of my panic. His expression softened. "Actually," he corrected himself, his voice dropping even lower. "I just didn't want to leave." We stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other over the rims of our coffee mugs. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air between us. The awkwardness I had dreaded, the morning after unease, it wasn't there. In its place was a quiet, fragile sense of wonder. "I thought you'd gone," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. His smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "No, Leo. I wouldn't do that." He reached out his free hand and gently touched my arm. "I'm not going anywhere. Unless you want me to." "I don't," I said, the words rushing out, desperate and true. "I really, really don't." A silent understanding passed between us. The fear began to recede, replaced by a burgeoning hope that felt both thrilling and terrifying. But then, the reality of our situation began to creep back in, a cold shadow at the edge of this warm, sunlit moment. "Alistair," I started, my voice hesitant. What is this? What are we doing? I'm still your student. My thesis." He held up a hand, silencing me gently. "Your thesis defense is scheduled for next month. Your grade for my seminar was submitted 2 weeks ago. As of the end of the semester, our official academic relationship is functionally over. This," he said, his gaze unwavering, "has nothing to do with that." He was addressing my fear directly, calmly dismantling it piece by piece. He had thought about this. This wasn't an impulse. The realization settled deep in my bones. His interest in me wasn't a whim, it was a decision. I have felt a connection to you for a long time, Leo, he continued, his voice low and steady. I have respected your mind, your passion, but I was your professor. There were lines I could not, and would not, cross. I waited. I told myself that if, at the end of your time as my student, I still felt this way, I would do something about it. Last night, I prompted, needing to hear it all. Your email last night was an excuse, he admitted with a small, wry smile. A flimsy one at that. I could have sent you a PDF, but I wanted to see you. I wanted to be in the same room with you, outside the confines of the university. I told myself I would just drop off the notes and leave. But when you opened that door, he trailed off, shaking his head slightly. I couldn't make myself go. Every word he spoke was a balm on the raw, insecure parts of my soul. He had seen me. He had wanted me. He had waited. The quiet integrity of it, the sheer, patient respect he had shown me, was overwhelming. We migrated to my small, wobbly kitchen table, the one I used for everything from writing to eating. We sat across from each other, our knees brushing under the table. The contact was no longer ambiguous or accidental. It was deliberate, a point of connection. The city was waking up outside my window, the sounds of traffic and life beginning to swell, but in my small kitchen, we were in our own world. We talked for hours, the coffee growing cold in our mugs. He told me about his life outside of the university, a life I had never been able to imagine. He told me about his quiet cottage upstate where he went to write, about his failed attempts at gardening, about a younger brother who lived in Oregon. He was no longer Dr. Finch, the imposing academic figure. He was Alistair, a man who liked old movies and strong coffee, a man who had been just as lonely as I was. And I talked too. I told him about my family, about growing up feeling like an outsider, about how books and films had become my refuge. I told him things I had never told anyone before, and he just listened, his attention a warm, steady presence that made me feel safe and seen. This was the conscious choice. This was the moment we moved past the intoxicating thrill of a first kiss and into the quiet, complex territory of building something real. It was terrifying. The power imbalance, the academic world we both inhabited, the potential for complications was enormous. But sitting here, with his knee pressed against mine and his kind, steady gaze on my face, none of that seemed to matter as much as the simple, undeniable fact that I didn't want this to end. So what happens now? I asked, the question hanging in the air between us. He reached across the table and took my hand. His fingers laced through mine, his palm warm and solid against my own. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a vow. Now, he said, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. You finish that brilliant thesis of yours, and I take you to dinner. A proper date. Somewhere far away from campus. He paused, his expression turning serious. And we figure it out. Together. Together. The word echoed in the quiet of the room. It was a word I hadn't dared to let myself hope for. The day passed in a dreamlike haze. Alistair eventually had to leave, a real-world meeting dragging him away. The goodbye at the door was hesitant, almost shy. He kissed me again, a soft, lingering kiss that tasted of coffee and promises. I'll call you tonight, he said. Okay, I replied, my voice breathless. After he was gone, I stood in my silent apartment, my fingers pressed to my lips. The air still held the faint scent of his cologne. The woolen blanket was still on the sofa. His coffee mug was in the sink. It was real, all of it. I walked over to my desk, to the blinking cursor that had been the catalyst for this entire, life-altering series of events. I looked at the screen, at the jumbled mess of my own words. The panic, the feeling of being trapped and overwhelmed, was gone. In its place was a profound sense of clarity. I knew what I needed to say. I sat down, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The words began to flow, effortlessly, beautifully. I was no longer arguing with long-dead theorists. I was writing for myself. I was writing with the quiet confidence of a man who had been seen and chosen. The folder of notes Alistair had brought sat on the corner of the table, unopened. I realized I didn't need them anymore. He had given me something far more valuable. The next few weeks were a strange and wonderful blur. I finished my thesis in a burst of creative energy, the words pouring out of me. Alistair and I spoke on the phone every night, our conversations stretching late into the night. We didn't see each other in person, a mutual, unspoken agreement to keep a respectful distance until my thesis was submitted and defended. It was a period of anticipation, of building a connection through words, a foundation for what was to come. My defense was a nerve-wracking affair, but I felt a new, unfamiliar confidence. Alistair was not on my committee, a professional courtesy he had arranged months ago, long before that fateful night. But I felt his presence in the room nonetheless, a quiet source of strength. I passed with distinction. As I walked out of the room, my mind reeling and my future suddenly an open, unwritten page, my phone buzzed. A text from him. I knew you would. I'm so proud of you. Meet me at the old oak tree by the library. I found him waiting for me, leaning against the massive trunk of the tree. He was wearing a dark blue sweater, and the late afternoon sun lit the silver in his hair. He looked up as I approached, and his face broke into that incredible, unguarded smile. He didn't say anything. He just opened his arms. I walked into his embrace, burying my face in his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent. He held me tightly, his arms a safe harbor in the overwhelming sea of my emotions. It's over, I murmured into his sweater. No, he said, his voice a low rumble against my ear. It's just beginning. That night, he took me to dinner. A small, quiet Italian restaurant with checkered tablecloths and candles flickering in wax-dripped bottles. It was as far from the sterile environment of the university as one could get. We talked and laughed, and he held my hand across the table. It felt normal. It felt right. After dinner, he drove us out of the city. The further we got from the familiar streets and buildings of my life, the lighter I felt. We drove for over an hour, the conversation dwindling to a comfortable silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the soft music playing on the stereo. Finally, he turned down a long, unpaved driveway, the headlights cutting a path through a dense forest of pine trees. We pulled up to a small, charming cottage, a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. This is my place, he said quietly. My escape. He led me inside. It was warm and cozy, filled with even more books than my apartment. A fire was crackling in the hearth. It was the quietest place I had ever been. He gave me a tour, his hand resting on the small of my back. He showed me the small study where he wrote, the windows looking out onto a dark, placid lake. That night, we made love for the first time. It was like the first kiss, slow and gentle, and filled with a profound sense of reverence. It was an exploration, a mapping of bodies we had both longed to know. It was an act of finally, completely closing the distance between us. Afterward, we lay tangled in the sheets, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. His arm was a heavy, comforting weight across my chest, his head resting on my shoulder. I could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against my own. I thought back to that night in my apartment, to the blinking cursor and the suffocating panic. I had felt so utterly alone, so lost. It felt like a lifetime ago. I had been a boy, observing life from a distance, afraid to participate. Lying here, in the arms of this kind, brilliant, wonderful man, I felt like I had finally stepped into my own story. He stirred beside me, lifting his head to look at me in the dim light. What are you thinking about? He whispered. Everything, I said, my voice thick with emotion. How everything has changed. He smiled and leaned down to kiss me softly. Good, he murmured against my lips. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him closer. The quiet of the cottage enveloped us. Outside, the world was dark and silent. But in here, I was safe. I was known. I was no longer yearning for something just out of reach. I was holding it in my arms. I had come home.